We are creatures of desire. What we most desire is meaning. What makes us suffer most is a lack of meaning.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Marital therapist, author, and communications trainer Andrew G. Marshall invites guests from all walks of life to discuss what makes life meaningful.
Hello, I'm Andrew G. Marshall. Welcome to The Meaningful Life. We're available on Apple, Spotify, Podbeam, and wherever you find your podcasts. There is one thing most couples would like to remove from their relationships. Any ideas? With 40 years working with couples, I would say the number one and the number two reasons people seek out my help have their roots in this issue. I believe most couples would love to remove conflict from their relationship, because who enjoys rows? Certainly not me. And endless or nasty fights is the number one reason couples seek my help. And the number two reason, all the passion has disappeared out of their relationship. More often than not, these couples describe each other as best friends, but they never argue. There is no conflict at all. Conflict is necessary. That's the message of my witness this week on The Meaningful Life. She's Polly Young-Eisendrath, who is a Jungian analyst, a Buddhist teacher, and the founder of a system of couples therapy called dialogue therapy, which she developed in the mid-80s. She's the author of 18 books translated into 20 languages, including You're Not What I Expected, Love After the Romance Has Ended, and Love Between Equals, Relationship as a Spiritual Path. She also has a podcast called Waking Up Is Not Enough, Flourishing in the Human Space. So, Polly, welcome to the podcast. Why is conflict necessary?
Well, thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. Yes, conflict is necessary for a number of reasons. One is that within ourselves we're conflicted. And, from the very beginning of life, we're not well aligned with ourselves. And as we move on in life, in many ways, things become more complex. And so we're conflicted in our desires. Often we don't know if we should, for example, take a nap or have lunch, really understand our own minds. And so then when it comes to relating to others, well, we're all in our first person experiences. And so we really can't see into each other's, as we call them in dialogue therapy, snow globes. We each is in kind of a bubble of our own subjectivity. That doesn't mean just our opinions and desires, but the way that we hear the bell, the way we see the tree. All of these things are subjective and individual. And so it's very difficult, actually, for human beings in any situation to really be true witnesses for each other, because it's very hard for us to see into each other's experiences. So conflict is necessary because it's part of being human. And if we avoid conflict, and here's the really hard part for those people who really want to avoid conflict, we tend to be dehumanizing each other because we don't get to know each other. And, in the past this isn't always the past, but in the past when many marriages were arranged marriages, people could avoid each other and perhaps not even be friends and still be married, because marriage was a contract that involved certain things having to do with the development of the family and was not by any means a personal relationship. And the personal side of it might not even be a promise. That is a possibility. But in this recent time, and certainly in the recent time in the West, but really only since about the middle of the 20th century, people have wanted to be friends, companions, and also essentially soulmates in their marriages, in the West at least. And so in a certain sense, we've put a tremendous burden on marriage, which is that we want it to be, personal, where we're known. We want it to be intimate, where we feel at ease and have sex. And we want also to be able to be together with somebody who might come from a very different background, different culture, different ethnicity, and yet we want that person to witness us, to mirror us, to know us, to see into us. So, all of these demands together make marriage in many ways a very anxious situation in this period of time. So yes, conflict is necessary. Also, the whole issue of wanting to be known is a complex humans.
A lot of people fear that they're in the wrong relationship, but you believe that we all marry the wrong person. So can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I wouldn't say it quite like that, but I think what you're getting at is that there is no perfect fit. There is no one out there who will get me exactly right. And yet, falling in love, romance, most people believe that it leads to a great long-term relationship, whereas, in fact, falling in love in a very immediate way leads to a certain kind of joint delusion about who the other person is and how they see you, And so when we fall in love, the ideal falling in love is that I look at you and I say, oh, you're the fairest in the land. You're the best person out there. And then you look at me and you say, no, you're the fairest in the land. That together creates an intoxication, which is really fairly narcissistic, because the idea is that you get me and you're perfect. And so I must be perfect too. And so together we're absolutely perfect as a couple. And, we're designed for each other. We're soulmates. How did we find each other out here on the mountain in Chile?
It's a miracle.
Whatever. And then, of course, what's going to happen is as soon as we are a couple and we have to make decisions together, especially financial ones, but possibly also about taking in someone else's children, those decisions put us into a power struggle. That power struggle can easily pull us out of the idea that we're just alike. And so at that point, couples that have fallen deeply in love and have felt that they were designed, the two people, just for each other, will often feel deeply betrayed, because it was originally, oh, you're my perfect partner. And now it is, wait a minute, you don't even understand how I make coffee. So that sense of delusion of falling in love, I'm all for it. I love it myself. I moved from one romance to another romance, in an earlier part of my life when I had lots of energy, because the romance itself is very, very intoxicating. However, if we know that there's going to be disillusionment, then the disillusionment becomes interesting, because it's in that disillusionment that I can come to know you as an individual, and that I start to be seen myself, because we're now in conflict. Now we have to make decisions, negotiate, see each other, and accept each other with our limitations.
So once we've got the illusion out of the way that you're perfect and I'm perfect, what a pity we've got to get rid of it, but we can actually really get to know each other now, and I can meet the real Polly rather than the Polly I've created in my mind. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yes, that's the idea. And then also the other idea is that you'll never really know the real Polly, because I don't know the Polly either. So we're in a process of discovery that can last for the rest of our lives, in which hopefully we're interested in each other. And, we're interested in the repeated jokes, the repeated stories, because the other person is telling them for a different reason right now than they told them last time. So this is where a relationship starts to be a spiritual practice, where we stay awake to the specific moment-to-moment arisings that are happening between us. We learn to tolerate the limitations. We learn to tolerate our own really negative irritations when the other person doesn't get us. We learn to tolerate the other person's habits. that might be really irritating when we see them up close. And those kinds of, let's say, practices of tolerance and returning to interest in the beloved, those are really by nature spiritual practices.
Yeah, I really understand what you mean when you say it's a spiritual practice, because tolerance and keeping curious rather than writing your own scripts, which is, they're stupid or they don't get me. That's a very easy shorthand. I mean, I can do that in 30 seconds, can't I? Less than 30 seconds. But actually finding out what you really mean, and it might be different today from yesterday, I mean, that is quite a big ask, isn't it?
Yes, and in a sense, because I'm a longtime practitioner of Zen Buddhism, I know how much people are seeking to be in the present moment. And, we're willing to go into 10 hours a day of meditation in order to learn how to be in the present moment. Well, a relationship with a close other will keep us in the present moment if we take it seriously, because the other person will make demands that we haven't thought of, we haven't experienced ever before if we remain interested in them. And this includes, of course, when the person is getting ill, declining, and dying. My longtime husband, Ed Epstein, died from early onset Alzheimer's. And so I went through a 10-year decline with him. For 6 years, he was in care, but I visited him all the time. And I witnessed him essentially going backwards in time. That is, moving from being a 59-year-old to a sort of a 12-year-old to a 6-year-old to a toddler to a baby. Because he was so young, he died from Alzheimer's. And so he had really eventually become a person who could not get out of a chair and couldn't talk. So going through all of that with him, I went through it training myself to be interested and not simply disappointed and afraid. It was an incredible journey. I have to tell you, I learned so much, and I truly loved him until the very end. And now he's been dead for 10 years. So, I've also gone through the transformations after his death.
So what did you learn about him going backwards, so to speak, like that? And what did you learn about the human condition almost at the same time?
What I learned essentially was that there was a quality. His name was Ed. Yeah. There was an Ed quality that remained through all of his time. And I have to say that he had, in his actual dying, which I was there, we had a sort of a team of people working with his dying process, which took 6 days and 6 nights. But through that, I witnessed lots of things about him. And one of those things was he had what's called terminal clarity. In his last couple of hours of dying, he regained all of his consciousness.
Wow.
He could speak, he could laugh. And it's rare, but it's about, I think, roughly 1 in 10 people who have severe dementia regain their consciousness when they're actually dying, when they're in this transition. And Ed did that. So that was one thing. And I've learned so much from it because he had no cortex. I saw a brain study of his brain 2 weeks before he died. So I absolutely got to know that consciousness does not rely on the brain. So that I learned. But in the actual decline, what I saw was that he retained a feeling of, or a sense of his particularity. The specific, he was himself. On the other hand, he became a child and a toddler and a baby. And I could see what made him happy and what did not make him happy. And I could, in many ways, because he was in care by that time, I could provide for happiness. So we could have laughing, good times, music. Not until the absolute end, the last 2 months, he was in a dementia unit. That was terribly difficult for him and for me because it was depressing. But prior to that, he had been in residential care with some assistance from outsiders. But what I learned was, number one, the involvement with another person can remain interesting if one is interested. Like it was always interesting. There was nothing boring about this way of being. Secondly, I learned that what I had loved so much about him as a partner was his witnessing of me, that he could keep track of me. He was interested. He was like the head of the archives. He remembered. He knew what we had done. And that's what he lost. In, his very first stage of the Alzheimer's, he couldn't track me. And then after that, he couldn't remember that I wasn't living at the care center. So he never knew that I drove away, and he didn't remember that I had a birthday, and he couldn't picture me when I wasn't in the room. And so that was interesting too, because it was as though I existed for him when I was absent from him, or I didn't exist at all except in the present moment. I couldn't tell, but just having that kind of a different way of relating where he didn't know when I was gone. He had no object constancy. He didn't know that I was out there. And there were many, many funny occasions, of course, and sometimes quite hilarious, because he couldn't tell what was going on. Like I would be driving the car and he wouldn't know why I was upset because we were in a terrible rainstorm and the road was slippery. He couldn't put all that together. So sometimes it was hilarious. He would say, well, what are you doing anyway? Because he could still speak. So there were wonderful things. There was nothing intolerable, really, after I knew what was wrong. And then I could see that dedicated interest in the beloved is what allows love to go forward.
My mother had dementia as well, and I would certainly go along with that sense of essential, in this case, Jillness, in the same way that you had essential Edness. My mother was generally a good sport and up for things right to the very end. And that was very moving, but I'm afraid to say I never managed to get the same degree of acceptance that you achieved.
Well, it was your mother. Mothers are in special categories also. And I have grown children. And, I could say so much about the issues involving love of your mother, but I think we're sticking to couples. So,
yeah. So how were you able to use this knowledge and insight with the couples you were working with? Because my assumption is all the way through that time you were still seeing couples. So how could you transfer this knowledge into the day-to-day world of your couples?
Well, let me say that one of the things I did, which is sort of one of my coping mechanisms, is that I wrote a book about the experience while it was going on. So I wrote a book called The Present Heart. The subtitle is A Memoir of Love, Loss, and Discovery. And during that time, I was learning from partly my experience, partly interviewing people that I had wanted to speak to about love, and then partly from listening to Leonard Cohen's songs repeatedly. I tried to interview Leonard Cohen. I got close, but did not get
cigar.
To it. No cigar, yeah. So the thing that happened for me is that I learned about the nature of love, and I tried to bring it into working with couples. And of course, I got to it by writing The Present Heart. And then later I wrote Love Between Equals, because I had learned what I needed to learn from this tragedy in my life, which is that probably the most important thing that a partner brings to us is the witnessing and the willingness to come back to witnessing again and again, even when there's misery and illness and decline.
And conflict.
And conflict. Well, conflict was really not a part of what was happening. Once Ed and I knew his diagnosis, in a remarkable way, we worked together. He was also a Zen practitioner. In everyday life without dementia, conflict is the thing that serves as the obstacle to being able to be a witness and being able to be, let's say, open to being interested again, trusting again the partner. The partner that you feel has betrayed you because you've asked 6 times that they clean the garage and they've always said, yes, they're going to do it. And then they never do it. And so that is enough for people to feel betrayed, weirdly, but they do. And, getting to the bottom of that is really an act of love. But many people don't have the skills. They don't have the skills to do that.
So let's try and think about what the skills would be to get to the bottom of, for example, why you're angry with me or why you won't clean the garage, even though you say you will. What skills do I need to get to the bottom of that conflict? Because conflict is okay if you actually can use it in a useful way and learn something and solve the problem. It's not much just use on its own.
So in dialogue therapy with couples, and this is a structured short-term form of a psychoanalytically oriented therapy that has a mindfulness base. In that form of therapy, we teach partners to use a skill called real dialogue, and to use it especially during conflicts and during these times of lack of trust, etc. And it involves 3 parts. The first one is speaking for yourself, but it's more than using I statements. It's speaking responsibly about your subjectivity, like, I remember it this way instead of it was this way. I read the data like this instead of these are the facts. Saying, I would like to go to Detroit instead of Detroit is a terrific city. These are the ways of speaking for oneself that lower the emotional threat level in the sense that the other person does not start to defend themselves before you've even finished what you have to say. So speaking for yourself means speaking subjectively, speaking responsibly, and then, speaking in chunks so that you don't do a whole dissertation where the other individual can't track you through that. So you stop, and the other person has a chance to do what we call mindful listening, which is paraphrasing by trying to step in and say, here's what I'm understanding. Like, I'm understanding, or I'm getting it like this, not I am hearing you say, because mostly people do not hear other people. They understand, they get a takeaway, but they don't really hear because they're not tracking very accurately. They're hearing their own inner voice speaking to them about what's going on. So, the first part is speaking for yourself, then listening mindfully means you paraphrase, you check it out. Did I get that? Did I get that? Is there more? And essentially, by speaking for yourself and listening mindfully, you get to the third skill, which is the third part of the skill, which is remaining curious. So, curiosity is an emotion that we're born with. Human infants are very curious. Now, when we block it in ourselves, it's because we're not really engaging in our experiences. So with a partner, when we're in conflict, if we don't feel curious, if we don't feel interested, it's because we're blocking that with either often it's rage or fear or sometimes the desire to attack. So a certain kind of fight, flight kind of reactivity. So, in teaching the skill of real dialogue, speaking for yourself, mindful listening, listen mindfully, remain curious, over and over and over again to partners when they're in conflict, in the actual dialogue therapy, there's an evaluation process at the beginning of the therapy. So we know the 2 individuals, and I coach, facilitate. If I'm working solo, I coach and facilitate, moving back and forth between the people. If I'm working with a co-facilitator, a co-therapist, we each work with one individual, and we're working with the people to set up what we call a mindful space, or a space between them in which that curiosity can always be opened up when they're in conflict. And so that requires, the lowering of the emotional threat, speaking for yourself, then being able to paraphrase. And so overall, this way of speaking and listening becomes mindfulness exercise. Whether or not you've ever practiced any kind of mindfulness, you simply have to begin to track what is going on in the present, because you're having to track how you speak and how you listen.
So what I'm hearing is we have to speak for ourselves. I remember it this way. I read it this way. I would like to go to Detroit. That's the first part of it. The second part is I'm not allowed to give a lecture because I can only speak in digestible chunks. And then my partner is going to summarize because they've been listening mindfully. Those are the first two stages. And when we get through to the third stage, we're going to remain curious about why the other person is feeling like this and what it actually means to go to Detroit, for example, rather than assuming we know what it's like to go to Detroit.
Exactly. And rather than arguing about whether Detroit is a fabulous city or not, which is what people get into, they start to make a case. If I were to say, Detroit is terrific, let's go there, you would say, oh my God, you must be out of your mind. Have you ever been there? And so what happens then is that a case is being made and an argument goes on about so-called objective reality, which is not anything that exists. There are only two people with their subjective experiences. So if I begin with, I would like to go to Detroit because I grew up there and I remember the parks, you might say, oh, you want to go to Detroit because you grew up there. And I could see how that might be meaningful for you. And we don't argue about Detroit then.
Yeah, and I could then be curious and ask, what else could we do in Detroit beyond visiting your childhood home, which I'm sure would be an interesting thing to do, but I wonder if Detroit's got other things to offer beyond your childhood home.
Yes, exactly. So it opens a space for each person to be present and also for no one to be humiliated and no one having to make a case for their own, let's say, facts and figures about why this is the case. Because that way of relating is an adjudication that belongs in debates, it belongs in courtrooms, and perhaps sometimes in scientific investigations, but not in an intersubjective dialogue with a partner, even if the two of you are scientists and you're talking about the outcomes of your data.
Because in 40 years of work, I've never actually had a couple that have settled an argument by going through, I'm right and you're wrong. It just doesn't work.
Exactly. It's exactly true, because that's a sort of zero-sum game, which essentially one person loses. And that doesn't work for couple relating. If you're relating as equals, then each person is valuable and each person is making sense.
But if we're equals and there seems to be a power struggle going on, or we're actually trying to, one person feels less equal than the other, or that they're being put down, how do you deal with the power struggles? Because, I mean, you must see a lot of power struggles too in the room.
Of course, of course. I mean, honestly, when people come to dialogue therapy, there's an opening conversation. We always ask, if it's just me solo, I say, I'd like to hear the two of you talk about why you're here, what you hope to get out of this. They don't talk to me, they talk to each other, and I'll hear the power struggle right away. So yes, power struggles are essentially based on emotional patterning that may go back to childhood. It typically does go back to emotional habits for each individual, but now they've transferred those habits into the current relationship. And what happens then is that each person has to make room by learning these skills and using them for both their own subjective experience and the other person's. And as they do that, gradually they can negotiate, typically, what they would like to do about whatever the problem is that they're struggling over. And it may even involve, for example, recently, a very typical kind of power struggle is, I get ready to go to the airport on time and you don't. And so we're always late because of you, And so the outcome of a real dialogue on that might be that the two people go separately and they meet up at the gate. And, that outcome might never have been arrived at if one person is proving why they're right and why the other person is wrong. And I've had people arrive at all sorts of solutions to their problems that I could never have imagined, like hire a shaman and get rid of the spirit that is causing the fear of driving the car. I mean, when people are able to talk to each other and really see that both sides are valid, there's a remarkable kind of relief. It's like lowering of a threat level. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, yeah, I get that, And then we might be very different in what we would like to do. So how can we work with that? How can we work that out so that each of us has the opportunity to do more or less what we want? We might have to give up something, but...
So often if we avoid conflict, it's going to go underground. What's the problem of having the conflict going underground? Because at least, we can sort of live in a sort of harmony.
So let me ask you, if your partner, let's say, refuses to talk to you about something that is important, or even something that is trivial, what goes on in your feelings?
Well, it depends. If it's a short-term refusing to speak to me because he needs time to process, and sort of come down off the cliff edge, so to speak, then although it's uncomfortable to be stuck in uncertainty, I've sort of learnt that it's better to let him be, because you don't really want to speak to somebody on the cliff edge. You want to wait till they're ready, and I've learnt to do that.
But if he avoids it going on over time, well, first of all, I imagine that you'd like it better if he says to you, give me a half a day or give me 2 hours, because I would
prefer that, but I know that I'm not going to get an approximation, because who knows how long you're going to take to come off the cliff edge.
Okay. So, if he were to avoid talking about something over a long period of time, when you are very interested in that thing, whatever it is, I imagine you would feel humiliated. I imagine you would feel possibly enraged because of the humiliation.
Yeah, you've got to remember that I come from a family that likes avoiding conflict, so I could possibly live with avoiding the conflict, to be perfectly honest. I mean, professionally, I know I shouldn't, but deep down inside, I have patterning that says, don't poke the dragon, so to speak, or the dragon being the issue.
Well, the thing is that, let's say, all of human beings and pretty much most of the mammals are, activated by the fight-flight reactivity of the limbic brain. And so the amygdala, the hippocampus, they provoke us to either fight or to avoid fighting or to freeze. And so, avoiding conflict is passive aggression. Active aggression, of course, is the fighting, the accusing, the attacking. Passive aggression is the ignoring, the stonewalling, the procrastinating. And typically for humans, either of those conditions, either the fight or the flight, will create threat. And sometimes the threat is the threat of being forgotten, being ignored, which can feel humiliating if you're with someone who cares about you and whom you care about. And so, yes, low conflict families, low conflict cultures. And I live in Vermont, which is close to Canada, and both Vermont and Canada are pretty conflict avoidant. They pretty much are into passive aggression. And consequently, people don't know each other well. And, my neighbor up the hill has lots of ideas about me, because every now and then one of these ideas comes out that are not true, because he doesn't want to talk with me about the driveway that we share, because he disagrees with the way that I have it plowed, etc. And so if I try to talk to him, he's often really kind of dismissive. And I know that he's conflict avoidant. And yet, if I push him hard, he does become aggressive. And so, the part of the problem with a conflict avoidance is that it can lead to a kind of dehumanizing of the other person, as though you've forgotten them, as though you don't know who they are. And with neighbors, with family members, there can be the feeling of lack of interest. Like, I don't care. I don't care what you think about this, because I'm not going to get into, a spat with you. So I think in a couple relationship, conflict avoidance can lead to, on one hand, some more peace and calm than, repetitive conflict. And so it leaves people sometimes in a more peaceful state. And yet it also can leave the two people with real emotional distance and lack of intimacy, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, because they don't really know each other very well, because they don't get into it. So I don't recommend either active or passive aggression for human beings. It's exhausting. Both are fairly exhausting, or at least defeating. Instead, what I recommend really is contact. And that contact has to happen carefully when there's conflict. And that's why we teach the skill of real dialogue, this 3-part skill. And even though at times when partners are learning this, speaking for yourself, listening mindfully with meaning theories, they find it tedious. They find it, irritating that we go back to this. No, you have to speak for yourself. You can't make a case about Detroit or whatever. But when they learn it, they start to feel there's a liberation, because conflict is not frightening now, and it's not distressing. We don't have to avoid it, and we don't have to pound it out. We actually can use it as a way of getting to know each other, because we have the skill.
So we've talked about the conflict avoidance, and we're going to talk about the conflict heavy in just a moment.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Please follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material and other benefits.
My men's retreat runs from Sunday the 28th of September to Wednesday the 1st of October in the woods just outside Berlin, Germany. Step out of your daily stress. Take stock of where your life is going and deepen your relationship with yourself and other men. One of the reasons everyone feels more anxious is not just the fast-changing world, but how we've become more isolated. In particular, we are cut off from the wisdom and support of other men, mostly because we find it difficult to open up and be truly vulnerable with each other. In my 4-day workshop with a group of like-minded men, we can focus on what it means to be a man today and how we can support our sons to become balanced men. It will be a truly transformative experience, and I would like to share it with you. You can find out more about the beautiful location, the seminar house itself, and the costs on my website, andrewgmarshall.com. Click on the button Men's Retreat. Do it now, because we've almost filled half the places.
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and Talkspace, the leading virtual therapy provider, is telling everyone, let's face it in therapy. By talking or texting with a supportive, licensed therapist at Talkspace, you can face whatever is holding you back, whether it's mental health symptoms, relationship drama, past trauma, bad habits, or another challenge that you need support to work through. It's easy to sign up. Just go to Talkspace.com and you'll be paired with a provider, typically within 48 hours. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule. Plus, Talkspace is in-network with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. Make your mental health a priority and start today. If you're not covered by insurance, get $80 off your first month with Talkspace when you go to Talkspace.com and enter promo code SPACE80. That's SPACE80. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com and enter promo code SPACE80.
At the UPS Store, we ensure your small biz stands out with a variety of high-quality paper stock options, banners, posters, brochures, and more. Most locations are independently owned. Product services, pricing, and hours of operation may vary. See Center for details. The UPS Store. Be unstoppable. Come into your local store today and get your print on.
So if you'd like to participate in the program and write a letter to me, you can go to my website, andrewgmarshall.com, and you go to the podcast section, and there's a form called Participate in the Program, and that's just what's happened here. We argue all the time over what seems like banalities. Worse still, they come out of nowhere, so I'm often on edge or walking on eggshells. It has taken all the closeness out of our relationship. A good example would be going out somewhere together. I'll want to be on time and I try and hurry up my husband. He will say that I'm pressurizing him and I'll get defensive and he'll accuse me of being passive-aggressive. Once we've started, we can spend hours sniping at each other. How can we have a normal conversation without everything escalating?
Well, it was the example that I did use earlier about, one person feeling that the other person is slowing down, being on time, etc. So I'm going to talk about this as emotional entanglement because the person writing it is saying that it can go on for days and hours. And so it's a kind of relentless repetition of an entanglement. And there's a term from psychoanalysis, there's a term for this that's called projective identification. And it's unfortunately a very abstract term. And now, because, things here in the U.S. are so conflicted, we have another word that people use often, which is called polarization, which is really a term that pretty much can stand in for projective identification, because the polarized parties repolarize again and again. They don't ever resolve their issues as this person is describing.
But let's stick with projective identification, because I think actually unpicking the term helps us really understand what's going on. So what am I projecting onto the other person?
Well, I would have to know the specifics to know exactly, because typically it's a reenactment of a parent-child relationship where, the person who's doing and often both people are projecting, by the way.
Yeah.
But this person who's writing to you may be projecting, something about relationship with a mother where she was in charge of the mother and had to make sure things worked out, etc. And she has a kind of panic that, mother has to do this because the rest of us are waiting. So she basically, let's say, I used to call it an internal theater. Now I call it a movie, like she's in a movie. And in her movie, various things have to go a certain way in order for everything to be okay. Mm-hmm. And she's kind of directing her movie. She's bringing her partner into it. She's casting her partner in a role. And then she's trying to get things right.
In this case, it would be casting her partner in the role of her mother.
In the role of her mother. Now, the partner is also in his own movie, which is different from hers. And so as he gets entangled with her, he's going to get triggered as well. And now in his movie, perhaps there's an overbearing mother or father or whatever who's always telling him what to do. He loses his autonomy. He can't get about and do what he wants to do independently. And so he has to actually always sort of defeat that other person in his movie. And he has to do that in order to be able to breathe, in order to be able to walk around. And so now he's cast his partner into the role of this person that's in his emotional memory. He might not even know. Emotional memory is not conscious typically. Often people don't know who they're casting or what they're doing. In dialogue therapy, we pull all of this apart. We give them a sense for what their movie is. So in this case, there's an ongoing, let's say, clashing of these two movies, and that's all that's going on. There's no relating going on. There's no closeness. Now, in terms of projective identification, something's being projected and something's being identified with both people in their separate movies. And this term comes especially from the psychoanalysis of Melanie Klein, then somebody named Wilfred Bion, who was an English psychoanalyst, investigated it further, and then Thomas Ogden, who's an American psychoanalyst, made it even clearer. All three of them recognized that this way of relating deadens actual contact. So the two people feel devitalized. They feel like it's actually killing their intimacy, and sometimes they feel as though they're more interested in the dog than they are the partner, because that deadness is not there with the dog. It's only with the partner, and often the couple, the two people, will have noticed this. This happens only when I'm relating to you. When I relate to my friend over here, this thing doesn't happen. It's only with you, so it must be you. So that entanglement is, I would say, the most painful thing that couples endure.
If you were going to put in a few words how you would untangle, what would you say?
Speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, remaining curious. It's the same thing. You have to learn to relate responsibly. And then after you do that for a while, now if you're in dialogue therapy, you also know something about your movie. But even if you're not, if you use the skill, after a while you recognize, wait a minute, this is just me. He's not making me miserable. I have a particular emotional pattern here that I'm carrying out. Now, I can't say that every person everywhere can discover what these kinds of emotional memories are, but I know that many people do know when they're triggered. They do know it. They know the fight-flight feeling. They know the upset, the humiliation, or the rage. They know what that feels like. At that moment, if they could pause and say, so what is this? Have I felt this in the past? Did I feel this when I was a powerless child? Did I feel this? Did I have this experience? They might begin to see their own movie and what they're imposing. But even without that, just speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, remaining curious, will create emotional space between you and the other person so that some vitality can come back to your contact. It's not so deadened. So it's the deadening of that contact that often brings people to couple therapy, where they say, no matter what we do, we can't seem to have a conversation about our problems, and we don't any longer feel close. We feel defeated.
And it really helps also to start thinking, instead of actually having what was beforehand 3 arguments at the same time, the fight we're currently having, the memory of all the fights we've been having in the past, and the ones from our childhood as well. I think we can possibly solve the one that's actually going on now between the two of us. We can't solve all of the past ones, and we certainly can't solve the old issues from our childhood, but we could possibly, if we can unhook all that other stuff, sort out this conflict that's sitting here right now about what time we're going to set off to go to the airport, for example.
Yes. We can work out a solution. We can negotiate a solution if we can speak with each other and also respect that space that each of us may have a very different need or desire. The one thing I would say about the past, and the past hurts, and again, in dialogue therapy, we always come to the place in the therapy where we make it clear that the deep hurt that was so troubling, whether it was a loss or an abuse or whatever, it was not the partner that did that. The partner may activate that wound, and that primary wound is your own responsibility, actually, in the end. You have to come to terms with your past, and in some way, either to accept it, to go to therapy, get help with it. But the primary wound, that deep wound that the partner may have been irritating through the projective identification was not caused by the partner.
A very good point. In a moment, we're going to be looking at the benefits of a conversation between the spiritual and the psychological. I think you've already begun to see that. But if you want to hear that bonus material, you can subscribe directly via Apple or Spotify. And if you want to become a supporter of the Meaningful Life and unlock the bonus material this way, in a moment, I'll give you the details. But before we do that, I have to ask you, as a witness on the Meaningful Life, what makes your life meaningful, Polly?
What makes my life meaningful? Almost everything. Almost everything I do.
Even making a cup of tea in the morning?
Making a cup of tea, or even, you and I were kind of wrestling with my microphone, and I found myself, once again, irritated by the technology, because I'm always feeling somewhat defeated by technology. But then as I moved through that, I thought, oh, this could plug it. Oh, there's that over there that goes into this. And there's a kind of a learning in that. It wasn't something I was seeking to learn, but the moment-to-moment engagement with whatever is coming up in my life is tremendously interesting if I don't actually feel defeated or betrayed by it. It's when I disengage that I feel so discouraged. And occasionally I can feel that way about American politics. I mean, I do feel at times that this is the least interesting thing in the world. And yet, because I work in the area of dialogue and so on, I have to get interested. But I find everyday life meaningful. I live on the side of a mountain. Nature is endlessly fascinating. I have a partner who's not very much like me, and he is very interesting because in many ways I feel that I have to interview him every day again to find out who he is. So, there's so much that humans can get engaged with because we're so complex. And I love my life, and my life has had lots of loss in it. It's had lots of complexity, but those complexities have also taught me a great deal, especially about the arc of a human life.
So thank you very much for that. And in a moment, we'll be having the bonus material.
You've been listening to The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. You can follow Andrew on Twitter, like him on Facebook, and please leave a review wherever you consume your podcasts. Making, editing, and distributing The Meaningful Life comes with substantial costs, and we'd like to ask for your help. Visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material for every program, send in a letter to be discussed by Andrew and his guests, and join a community of other people seeking to make their life meaningful. At the gold level, you get even more benefits. Production of The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall is by Michael Dooney. Social media by Madeleine Healy. Sound engineering and theme tune by Sebastian de la Luz Mendoza. And I'm Susie Colick. Please tell your friends and spread the word. Thank you.